Good evening. I'm Jack Tannenbaum, president of the Men's Club of Temple Beth Am and chair of the committee for tonight's Holocaust commemoration program. This program has been put together in cooperation and collaboration with Next Generations, an organization of children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. You will hear more about this organization in a little while. To begin the program, Rabbi Alon Lefkowitz of Temple Beth Am.
Thank you. I'm Rabbi Alon Lefkowitz, and it's a great honor to host this important program here in our temple. Thank you, and thank you, our wonderful Men's Club, for making it all happen. And it's an honor to be able to share a few words. In the 1940s, there was a rabbi who was very popular in his yeshiva, Rabbi Hyman. And the reason that he was so beloved by the student was his style of lecturing. Because when he stood on the bima, he gave all he had. He was using his voice to the maximum. He was walking all over the bima. He was using his hands to explain the issues of the Talmud. If the stories about him were written today, they probably would have said that he was in his zone when he taught. When the class was over, he was exhausted. He needed to sit for a while. On one very stormy morning, only 4 students were able to make it to the large hall where Rabbi Hyman was teaching. He, of course, was there, but the students were surprised that Rabbi Hyman not only held the class as scheduled, but taught it in the same style that he taught when there are hundreds of students all over. When there was a short pause, one of the students referred to him and said, "Rabbi, please, it's only the 4 of us who are here." Rabbi Hyman looked at him and said, "No, I'm teaching the 4 of you, but that's not all. I'm also teaching your children and their children and their children. I'm teaching hundreds of people now, and that's a great responsibility." Our program tonight, we have all over, we have Holocaust survivors. We have their children. We have their grandchildren. Even my son is here helping a grandchild. And we have a great responsibility. Not only to passively remember what happened, but actively work as hard as we can to make sure that something like the Holocaust will never happen again. Thank you very much.
Tonight's program focuses on the children of Holocaust survivors. Approximately 75 million people died during World War II, including over 20 million combatants and over 40 million civilians who died because of deliberate genocide, massacres, mass bombings, disease, and starvation. Of these civilian deaths, 6 million were Jews. We have read and seen the testimonies of those who survived. We have read many books and watched countless documentaries. We have learned well the history of state-sponsored hate and murder. The Nazis had more than 15,000 internment facilities, including jails, prisons, ghettos, POW camps, and of course, concentration camps ranging from work camps to extermination camps. We know the horror of people treating each other as less than human with no right to live, whose only function is to work and die, mainly to die. The trauma caused by surviving the horror of being a prisoner in such unspeakable conditions changed every Jew that came out of the camps. But what about their children and grandchildren? How were they affected by an event that occurred before they were born? There have been numerous studies by a host of researchers that show that trauma is genetically transmitted to subsequent generations. Tonight, we will hear from three of those second-generation survivors. Gerard Loeb, on my far left, of Next Generations, whose parents were transported to Auschwitz from France. Becky Stern, whose parents were from France and Poland. Her mother, Sarah Lou Miller, wrote Hiding in Plain Sight, Eluding the Nazis in Occupied France. And me, whose parents were sent to the ghettos and camps from the very beginning of the war. At this time, I would like to introduce Gerard Loeb of Next Generations to briefly tell you about the work of that organization.
Thank you, Jack. Next Generations of Holocaust Survivors is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 2004 by children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Next Generations is dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism and other bias through education. We are committed to tell the story of our parents to the next generations and teach them the lessons of the Holocaust. In order to conduct its mission, Next Generation relies on generous survivors, children of survivors, and educators who volunteer their time in support of teachers by making presentations on the Holocaust in the classroom. Next Generations conducts seminars for community organizations on various topics related to the trauma of the survivors and its intergenerational transmission. Next Generation has developed programs to engage the students at becoming active and caring citizens and empower them at building a better world for themselves and their children. If not us, who? We thank you very much for your support, Jack.
I am Becky Stern. Please join us in Emela Rachamim, led by Marcy Morris, cantorial soloist at Temple Beth Am. This prayer is recited at Yizkor and was said by many of the Jews locked in packed cattle cars on their way to their deaths.
El malei rachamim, shochen bamromim, hamtzei menucha nechona, tachat kanfei hashchina, im kedoshim otorim, kezohar harakia mazirim, lenishmat yakireinu shalchu leolamam, Baal harachamim yastirem, beseter knafav leolamim. Bitzror, bitzror hachayim et nishmatam, Adonai hu nachalatam, v'yanuchu b'shalom al mishkavam, v'nomar amen. Merciful God, God Most High, let there be perfect rest for the souls of our loved ones who have gone into eternity. May they find shelter in your presence among the holy and pure, whose light shines like the radiance of heaven. Compassionate God, hold them close to you forever. May their souls be bound up in the bond of life eternal, and may they find a home in you, and may they rest in peace. And together we say, Amen.
Thank you, Marcy. Can we go to the candle lighting?
Good evening. My name is Gerard Loeb. On behalf of Next Generations, I have the privilege and the honor of introducing to you the survivors who will be lighting 6 candles in memory of family members and of the 6 million for these 2021 Yom HaShoah commemorations.
My name is Anita Carl. I was born in Lwów, Poland. I light this candle in honor of my father, Samuel Carl, who gave his life so my sisters and I could live. In honor of my grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, and the 6 million brothers and sisters, of whom 1.5 million were innocent children brutally murdered without compassion. May their memories live forever into the future and eternity. Thank you.
This is Paulette Pfeiffer, but I was born Paula Rosenfeld, and my family name on my mother's side was Minsky, and my entire family was killed. And I light this candle to commemorate, and I don't know if you can see it with the shine, and I light this candle for their name and for the rest of my family who was killed in Łódź, Poland. My family is from Łódź. I was born in Russia. And I light it also for the 6 million Jews that died innocently at the hands of the Nazis. Thank you, Yom HaShoah, and the Next Generation for inviting me to be part of this.
Thank you, Paulette. Magda?
My name is Magda Bader. My family's name was Sternberg. I'm from Mukachevo. That was Czechoslovakia when I was born, then became Hungary. My parents, my 4 sisters, and I and my niece were together in Auschwitz until we arrived there. My parents, my 2 sisters, my little niece, 3-year-old, died there. I survived with 3 sisters from Auschwitz and another camp, which was a satellite of Bergen-Belsen. I am honored that I have this opportunity to light a candle in memory of their lives. And I am lighting this candle to remember the 6 million children and adults who died innocently just because they were Jews. I hope that their memory will live for a long, long time, and these things will never happen again.
Thank you, Magda. Peter?
Peter Tarjan. I was born in Budapest. I light this candle in memory of my parents, my grandparents, 15 other close relatives, including 4 small children again. I'm lighting this candle now in 2021, 77 years after they were taken to their death innocently. Thank you.
My name is Joel Nomik. I was born in France in 1942, 3 months after my father was sent to Auschwitz. I was born in a Jewish family with 2 older siblings, and I'd light this candle in memory of my father, Jean Nomik, who died in Bergen-Belsen in May of 1945 after being liberated, and in memory of our cousins Ernst and Liesel Raskin, who were gassed and burned in Auschwitz upon arrival from France in the spring of 1942. And for all the 6 million, and especially the 1,500,000 children, to commemorate this day of Yom HaShoah.
My name is Laszlo Sally, and I light this candle in the memory of my parents and the 6 million innocents killed during the Holocaust.
Thank you. My name is Barry Ogren, and I'm Vice President of the Men's Club and will be tonight's moderator. And welcome, Gerard, Becky, and Jack, and we thank you for agreeing to share your experiences with us tonight. A number of discussion questions have been developed for this panel. If anyone is watching on live stream and has a question to ask a panel member, please submit it in the chat box, and we'll try to answer this evening. We will start by asking each panel member to tell us a bit about yourself, where you were born, where you grew up, and Gerard, we'll start with you.
Before starting my remarks, I'd like to recall the names of members of my family who were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. Lucie Lévy-Loeb, my grandmother, Stéphanie Loeb-Carence, my aunt, Jacqueline Carence, my cousin, Ernest Carence, my uncle, Max Bibelezer, my uncle. I would like to remember with special affection inmates, prisoner number B 13726 at Auschwitz-Birkenau. My father, Marcel Loeb, and prisoner A 4946 at Auschwitz-Birkenau in Bergen-Belsen, my mother, Helen Bibelezer Loeb. I was the firstborn of 2 French Holocaust survivors who married in Paris in May of 46, a year after their return from the death camps. 2 people out of the 2,500 who made it back, out of the 78,200 Jews deported out of France. I was born in June of 47, a year after the marriage of Marcel and Hélène. I was raised and schooled in the 8th and 16th arrondissement of Paris, completed an MBA at the University of Paris, and emigrated to the United States in 1974. I'm the proud father of Eric and Stephanie, and grandfather of Max, Isabel, and Benjamin.
Good evening, and thank you to the Men's Club for inviting me to participate this evening on this panel. My parents, Sarah Lou Miller and Joseph Miller, are both Holocaust survivors. My father was in the army in Poland when the war broke out and spent a good deal of the war in camp in Siberia. After the war, he returned to Poland until his emigration to the U.S. in 1953. My mother was one of 8 children. She was also born in Poland, but her family emigrated to France just prior to the war. She was about 5 years old at the time. Her entire family amazingly survived by assuming French names while in hiding in separate locations throughout France. My mother was also recruited by the underground, La Sixième. After the war, she spent 7 years in Israel before emigrating to the US, and my parents met at a Jewish singles dance in New York City. My brother and I grew up in Stanford. Growing up, honestly, I didn't really give much thought to being the child of Holocaust survivors because all of my parents' friends were Jews, and most of them were survivors as well. It was our normal. Everyone had an accent, everyone was an immigrant. Oftentimes at gatherings, there'd be multiple languages going on at the same time. This was the world I was raised in, and it was our normal. So we didn't necessarily think of it as anything terribly different. It was not until later on that started to creep into our consciousness. But I will say a common thread amongst many of my peers was that we only had shreds of extended family. Again, this was the norm in my community growing up. Some of the Greena, as my parents referred to them, the greenhorns, had some extended family. Unusually, my mother's family actually all survived, all 8 of them and her parents. They were all living in New York at the time, except for my mother, and who was living in Connecticut with our family. My father, on the other hand, lost his mother, and he had a sister who emigrated to Israel, who I only met once when she came to visit when I was a teenager. My mother is now 94. My father passed away sometime in the mid-90s, and she's still quite active, thank God. And that's just a little bit about my family and where I grew up.
I was born in a displaced persons camp in Landsberg, where my parents lived after the war, liberated by the Russians. That's why they went to the American zone. And I lived there for 2 years until we came to the United States. Landsberg was the largest Jewish displaced persons camp in Europe. And by 1950, it was gone. And I remember coming to the United States, and I remember trying to learn English.
Okay, the first question that we have for the panelists: when did you learn of your parents' Holocaust experience, and how did they explain their survival? Becky, we'll start with you.
I would say the Holocaust was a fixture throughout, a sort of a running thread through our family life. I learned about my parents' experiences in bits and pieces. There were stories that were told, but I knew very little. However, I will confess, I didn't really ask a lot of questions. It wasn't something it even occurred to my brother and I to really do, to ask a lot of questions as we were children. Again, this was, within our community, it was the norm not to know a lot of specifics about our families at that time. I will say, in contrast to that, my father, who was very private about his personal life, was a fierce public advocate for remembering and teaching about the Holocaust. When they opened the JCC, a new building in Stanford, he insisted not just about having a Holocaust memorial at the site of the new JCC, but it had to be by the front door. So you couldn't not see it as you entered the JCC for whatever wonderful activities you were doing. And that was very important to him. So again, I knew a lot about the Holocaust in some regards, but not a lot of what you might say is really important information at that time about my own particular parents and their work. Later on in life, my mother did take a writing course, and she wrote essays about her memories, is what she called them. Those essays later turned into the book that was mentioned in the introduction, so that is out there too now. But I read it as well, knowing some of it, but not all of it. So I think at least in my case, my parents weren't ready to talk too much about their experiences.
It's hard for me to pinpoint a time when I learned about my parents' experience, because I learned from a very young age, bits by bits, like a dripping faucet. I, of course, had noticed my parents' numbers tattooed on their forearm. When I asked the question to my dad, he said, well, that's my telephone number. I had it tattooed here so I wouldn't forget about it. Then I was, of course, eavesdropping on my parents' conversation with camp companions who would come to our apartment to visit. Those companions of death camps were introduced to me as aunts and uncles, but the conversation was very unusual, I would say. Even though I was sent to my room, of course, I was in the hallway listening to what was going on, and the conversation was very surprising. I also learned from observing my parents. My father had an obsession with food, constantly reminding us to eat everything in our plate. And my mother, on the other hand, would not really make any further comments. But getting certain indications that things were not totally right in our house. My mother, the depression that would send her for days in the darkness of her bedroom, her mood swings, her anger, her excessive possessiveness, a distrust in others. On the other hand, my father was a very optimistic person, always laughing, telling jokes. So, as you can see, my learning about my parents' experience was a little bit challenging, I would say, until I was able to sit down with my dad. I was already 33 years old, and interviewed him for about 2 hours about his experience in the camp and even his journey to the camp. I learned a lot, very much so. He would never approach anything regarding the atrocities that he had witnessed. But he conveyed something important, that really his survival was mostly due to an incredible luck, staying out of the path of death. I even learned that one day he had been selected and that he was saved at the last minute because an SS was looking for inmates to build boat, whatever, protections out of the clothes that they were stealing from inmates. And so my father was pulled out of the group of people that had been selected to get the gas chamber that day. But I would add also that I learned that my father had very good instincts and reactions. Like, for instance, he was a heavy smoker. The day he arrived in Auschwitz, he noticed that people were trading bread for cigarettes. And he understood immediately that if you wanted to survive, you couldn't do that. So I think that was a very intelligent response to what he could observe. And what kept him in life, he told me about it, was his total love and devotion to his mother, who he thought he would be reunited with if he made it alive. Unfortunately, that was not to be.
I don't remember ever not knowing that my parents had gone through something. The number was on my mother's arm, and I might have asked her about it. And I knew that we were different from the other kids in the neighborhood. And I knew that they had gone through something painful. We never really talked about it. The only time that my father said anything about the camps was when he was with someone who had been in them with him, and they would recount things that they thought were great. I remember my father talking to one of his friends saying, "You remember that time we found a piece of chalk and we wrote that stuff about Hitler on the outhouse wall and the SS went crazy? That was fun." But I never asked much because I knew it was too painful. My father was one of 8 siblings. He was the only one left alive. My mother was one of 10. She and a sister survived. Everybody else was murdered. And my mother was previously married, had a husband and 2 children who died in Auschwitz. So the pain was always there underneath a very thin layer of normalcy.
Okay, that kind of leads into the next question. How did an event that happened before you were born affect you? And do you see yourself as a Holocaust victim or survivor? Jack, you can start on that.
Yes. Okay, next. No. I consider myself a victim because a great deal was stolen from me. I just told you about my aunts and uncles, and they were all murdered. So aunts, uncles, cousins, who knows how many people would have been in my family. They were stolen. Their lives were stolen. They were stolen from me. I grew up with ghosts. How did it traumatize me? Pretty good. I'm pretty traumatized by it. And that's why tonight's program I thought is important. It's one of the things that are obvious. This is very personal to me, and it's one of the things I've tried to do all my life.
It's an interesting question because I was never at risk, from my own life in the way that my parents and everyone's families were. So it's almost like, how dare I even ask that question? Am I a victim or a victim at all? I mean, it just seems, in some ways, like I don't have the right because I wasn't directly impacted, although I was, obviously, as a second. But I do believe that as offspring of survivors, surely we were victims in some regards, and that there is this transference because our parents didn't develop the way they could have, and they had horrible things happen to them and to people around them, and they were traumatized. And so how do you not share that trauma? But I will say on the other side, something about my parents that I guess maybe it's what I chose to focus on, because yes, like other parents, my parents also had bouts of depression and a lot of anxiety about whether they were worthy and whether they belonged, etc. But again, because that was the community I grew up in, I kind of accepted that and didn't really realize there was some other way that families related. But I do really think about, in terms of being a survivor, that it's so impressive to me how, despite all these things that so many people went through, how is it that, I always wondered, how is it that my parents still felt like they could live a life? They may not have felt they deserved to live that life, but they still pursued it. There was a lot of laughter in my household. A lot of the jokes were not jokes that were available to my brother and I as children, but nonetheless, there was a lot of laughter. And I really admired my parents for finding the way to falling in love and to starting a family and to laugh about things that were worthy of a laugh, despite all what they went through and despite their ongoing insecurity about who they were and whether they were good enough, not just as individuals, but good enough. Were Jews good enough? Were we good enough? So I think that's an interest, for me, that's something I guess I've held on to, was this ability to start over.
To answer the question, how did an event that happened before you were born traumatize you? I found a very good quote from the book of Alan Epstein called Conversation with Sons and Daughters of Survivors. It's a book that was printed in 1979. Ellen said in that book, in the introduction of that book, she said something that I think really summarized it all. It says, I set out to find a group of people who, like me, were possessed by a history that they had never lived. I wanted to ask them questions so I could reach the most elusive part of myself. I would not have been able to say it better. Now, I do, yes, consider myself as, because I am the product of two survivors, I am both a survivor and a victim. The victim of a legacy of an unimaginable suffering. But, saying that, I never indulged in self-pity. I was angry for a long time, harbor a lot of anger to a lot of things. But this anger, I was able eventually to channel it. And I would venture to say that it made me very resilient and propelled me through the pitfalls of life. Long before the concept was discovered, became kind of very much contemporary of us today, and even was coined. I knew that my mother had transmitted to me her PTSD. I knew it. I felt that my not constant, but often unhappiness, criticism, my quick judgment of people and situations had to come from her. As a child, I was dyslexic and suffered from ADD, even though ADD did not exist in my time. And I had pugnacious asthma, which I will remind you is a psychosomatic illness, still today, even though I have medication to control it. And I think that these conditions cannot be unrelated to the transfer of PTSD. On the other hand, or in addition to it, my love of life and my keen sense of humor and my concern for others definitely came from my dad.
All right, the next question, what are the effects on Jewish identity from your parents' experiences? Jack, we'll let you start on that one.
I think it makes it more acute, increases it. When you have a personal history of persecution because you were a Jew, then being a Jew becomes more important. I'm not sure that's clear, but it is in my own head. And I was raised Orthodox, and being a Jew was very important. Jews came out of the camps one of two ways. They either still believed in God or they became atheists. And my father came out of the camps with his belief in God intact and his Judaism intact. And that was important to him, and it's important to me.
I would say that I am a very proud Jew, but I've always felt, in some regards, because of my parents' background, that my Jewishness was more of a nationality than just a religion. And I think that's something, maybe because my parents, their life, they spoke Yiddish at home, and my mother spoke Hebrew, and they were able to be very naturally Jewish in a way that didn't require necessarily performing rituals in a way. I'm not sure I'm explaining it, but I do think that my Judaism for me is an ethnicity. It includes history and culture and language and religion. And I don't see myself, even though I consider my Judaism my nationality, I don't really see myself as less of an American because I'm Jewish. Although I will be honest that, and maybe this is my learned insecurity, I am alert to being viewed as less of an American because I'm a Jew. And certainly in the past few years, with the increasing openness about racism and anti-Semitism, that has put me on high alert. So that's what I would say.
Well, my parents were not religious people. During the interview I was referring to earlier, my father told me that I asked him, where was God in Auschwitz? He told me something surprising. He said, Auschwitz has nothing to do with God. It was a matter between men. And that really got me thinking. Neither my parents were religious people. We were traditionalists. We would go to temple for the high holidays. As a child, I was being raised in France, in Paris, after the war, where the Jews really were still living a big trauma. The French Jews had been traumatized. Not only because the Nazis were sending them to death camps, but also because they lived under a fascist regime who was fully aligned with Berlin. So I grew up with mixed messages. I studied kindergarten in a Franciscan school, and I could recite then the Hail Mary and Our Father. I was very proud of it. I had memorized all that stuff. At the same time, I was going to the synagogue with my dad and my uncle, and I was sitting there, and we were listening to, it was a conservative synagogue, so we were listening to hours of service. I would enjoy a Christmas tree that my mother would put up in our house for Christmas. I would never miss the traditional Easter egg hunt. And each year I was attending, since my father was a stockbroker, I was attending the stock exchange Christmas party for kids, where I had my first taste of Coca-Cola. But it's later in life, even after my bar mitzvah, that and that joins what Becky is saying, I really joined into a community of Jews. I'm very attached to my roots. I'm very proud of them. I am very attached to the state of Israel. My father was a big macher for Israel. And I'm a little macher, but I'm following in his shoes. So definitely, I knew that I'm a Jew. I'm proud of it. And I raised my children accordingly. And they are Jewish and they know about their roots. But I think, like what Becky was alluding to, is that maybe the Holocaust shaped my Judaism more so than the religion and the synagogue.
Gerard, that gets us into our next question. Do you think you were raised differently because of your parents' experiences, and did this affect the way you raised your children?
Raised differently, it's hard for me to say. I was raised as a child from a typical French middle-class family. You know, in those days, there were no French Jews. There were French Israelites. We were French in our religion. We were not Catholics. We were not Protestant. We were Israelites. That was the way the Ashkenazi community of France was defining itself. It's later on that the Jewish concept came into play, and very much so with the great arrival in great numbers of the Sephardic from North Africa. So I was brought up as a French kid. It is clear that I was raised differently because of my parents' trauma, my parents' mishigas, and that's the way it was. I'm a child of survivors. And when it came to my children, I made sure to go the other way, in the sense that I gave them freedom, I gave them self-esteem, in my own opinion, which I didn't have. I always gave them words of encouragement. I let them make their choices, which I never did as a child, I'm talking about. And even mistakes, to a certain extent. My children were raised Jewish with a very strong Jewish identity, I would say, thanks to their mother, who was very Zionist and far more, maybe religious than I was. And there were definitely no Christmas trees and Hail Marys for them.
I would say that, of course, my parents' experiences, they raised us differently. They were very protective, but they also didn't have, well, my father had more of a normal childhood because he was older when the war broke out, but my mother did not have a normal childhood. So there were no birthday parties, they would celebrate our birthday, but we didn't get cards, we didn't get all the things that I saw on TV everybody else was getting, kind of thing. And interestingly enough, they did not want us to learn Yiddish. They didn't teach us Yiddish. That was their language for them. I don't think it was because they didn't want us to speak it. I just think it was because that was their language and they wanted us to be American, I guess. But one thing I think, in terms of my own parenting, I wanted to also create for, and not just be my husband as well, but I'm just talking about me right now, wanted to create a rich cultural, ethnic experience for my children as Jews, which was harder for me to do than it was in some regards for my parents because I didn't have the language and that kind of thing. But interestingly enough, when our kids were born in Houston. And when we moved there, and I had grown up in Connecticut, big Jewish community. And again, I said I didn't really have a lot of intimate relationships with people outside of that community. But when we moved to Texas, I had no idea how small a Jewish community could be. And it was an interesting challenge for me and for my husband to create a Jewish home for them. Now, our synagogue was a small startup, and so that was kind of fun. We all really kind of stuck together. But still, at the elementary school where my kids went and where I was teaching at the time, there were 6 Jews among 600 people in there. And my 2 children and I were 3 of those Jews. So that was what they grew up with. And, there was a lot of, there were incidents where people asked us, we might have been the first Jews they had ever met. Do we celebrate Thanksgiving? It was always a challenge for us to explain why everybody else was doing Christmas and we weren't. But we got past those few challenges. But the interesting thing was, eventually we moved back to Philadelphia, and I was so thrilled to be once again in a big Jewish community, big enough where the schools were closed on the Jewish holidays. Well, for my children, that was not a positive thing, because they were used to being the special ones who got a few days off for the Jewish holidays. Of course, they went to shul, but nonetheless, they got off. And meanwhile, when we moved to a bigger community, they were, the first year, were a little shocked that how come everybody else gets to go out and play and have a day off, and I have to get dressed up and go to the synagogue. So it was kind of interesting because it didn't even occur to me that that would be something they would think of. But that was the way, that was their experience. So yes, I guess it, in some regard, obviously it affected how we parented, but the big thing was really to try and give them a proud Jewish experience.
I'll make this brief because it's getting late, but it certainly affected the way I was raised. I was the golden child. My mother was told after the war in the displaced persons camp, my father was told that if my mother didn't have something to live for, she would be dead within months, and that resulted in me. I didn't play sports because you could get hurt. I didn't do Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts because kids in uniform, not a good idea. Never went to camp. The word camp was anathema in my house. You didn't sleepaway camp. You didn't go to camp. And when my parents were very protective, very close. I couldn't get away with anything. So it was a very limiting kind of growing up. And did that influence how I raised my children? Yes. My older daughter says she was raised by wolves because we gave her so much freedom that she doesn't remember us doing anything. We were sort of hiding in the bushes. Even when I was in college and graduate school, my father used to call me like 3 times a day just to make sure I was breathing. So I, like Gerard, went the other way.
It is getting late. I do want everybody to know that the email addresses of all these panel members will be displayed on the screen at the conclusion of this event. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to email these folks. We did have, Jack, we had a question about, do you have any recollection about the survivors of the Landsberg displaced persons camp from somebody who just called in?
The Landsberg camp was the biggest Jewish displaced persons camp in Europe. It had its own government, it had its own theater, it had its own newspaper. It was an entire community. And it lasted 5 years. My parents got married in the camp. One of my surviving cousins got married in that camp. I still have the ketubah, my parents' ketubah, handwritten in the camp. But recollection of the camp itself, I have pictures of me in that camp, but I don't remember much. My first memories were here in the United States, learning English.
All right, we thank you. And Becky and Marcy, I guess we're ready for the Holocaust Mourners Kaddish.
If you're able, please rise. Yitgadal,
Auschwitz,
V'yitkadash,
Lodz,
Shemei Rabbah,
Ponar,
Be'alma Divra Chirute,
Babi Yar,
Be'amlich Malchute,
Majdanek,
B'chayechon U'vyomechon,
Birkenau,
B'chaye Dechol Beit Yisrael,
Kavno,
Ba'agala U'vizman Kariv,
Janowska,
Ve'imru, Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah Vorach Elam U'lalmei Almaya. Yitbarach Ve'yishtabach
Theresienstadt,
Ve'yitpa'ar Ve'yitromam
Buchenwald,
Ve'yitnaseh Ve'yitadar
Treblinka,
Ve'yitaleh Ve'yithalal
Vilna,
Shemei Dekucha Brichu
Bergen-Belsen,
Le'ela
Mauthausen,
Min Kol Birchata Ve'shirata
Dachau,
Tushbechata Ve'nechemata
Minsk,
Da'amiran Be'alma
Warsaw,
Ve'imru, Amen. Yehi Shalama Rabba Min Shemaya, V'chayim Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'imru, Amen. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom, Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael,
Ve'imru, Amen.
Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'imru, Imru, Amen. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael.
Thank you all. Thank you for participating. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us. To paraphrase the Passover Seder, next year, here again.
Yeah. In my name and the name of Next Generations, I'd like to thank you.
And thank you to Rabbi, Marcy, the entire staff for helping us put this together, and to Next Generations, without whose help this would not have happened. Thank you.